are not my mother, and you never will be." I said that to a woman named Eileen when I was 14 years old, standing in her kitchen, and I watched it land on her like a slap. And then, this is the part I need you to hear, I spent the next 40 years making sure she never had a single reason to doubt that I had meant it. I am telling you that ugly sentence first, in my own voice, because I have spent the last year unable to escape it, and because everything else I am going to tell you is the story of how wrong that 14-year-old girl was, and how long it took her to find out. The woman I said it to is dead now, and a few weeks after she died, a box arrived at my door with my name on it, and inside that box was the evidence that I had been wrong about Eileen for 40 years. My name is Diane Mercer. I am 49 years old, and I have worked as a dental hygienist here in Grand Rapids, Michigan, for most of my adult life. I'm going to tell you about my stepmother, and the story I was handed about her when I was a child, and the box of photographs that finally, far too late, told me the truth. Because I did not arrive at hating Eileen on my own, hatred like that, in a child, does not grow from nothing. It is planted. My parents, Gordon and Sharon, divorced when I was 12 years old, and I want to be careful and fair here, because being fair is the entire lesson of this story, and I did not learn it for 40 years. A divorce, to a 12-year-old, is not an event you understand. It is an earthquake you survive. One year, I had a house with 2 parents in it, and the next year I had 2 smaller houses, a suitcase, and a mother who cried in the evenings. And a child in that situation needs, desperately, for the earthquake to have a cause, because an earthquake with a cause is a thing you can be angry at, and anger is so much easier to hold than grief. I needed a reason my family had broken, and a reason was provided for me. The reason was Eileen. Within a couple of years of the divorce, my father married a woman named Eileen, and the story that came to me, through my mother's sister, through the whole grieving wing of my family, was clear and complete, and required nothing further from me. Eileen was the other woman. Eileen was the one who had turned my father's head, who had broken up a happy marriage, who had walked in and taken my father and left my mother to cry in the evenings. Eileen was cold. Eileen was calculating. Eileen was the intruder. I was 13 when that story finished setting in me, and it set like concrete, and on top of that concrete, I built my entire relationship with my stepmother, which is to say, I built a wall. I want to tell you what 40 years of that wall actually looked like, day to day, because a wall like that is not loud. It is just relentless. I was never dramatic about it. I did not scream at Eileen or make scenes. What I did was quieter and, I think now, far crueler. I was polite to her. Politely, perfectly, frozenly distant for 40 years. When I was at my father's house, I treated Eileen like a hotel employee, courteous, brief, and absolutely never warm. I called her Eileen, never anything softer, and I made sure the word came out cool every time. When she tried, and she did try, especially in the early years, when she offered to teach me something, or asked about my school, or knocked gently on the door of my life, I closed it. Always. Gently, politely, completely. I had been told who she was, and I was a loyal daughter, and being warm to Eileen would have felt like a betrayal of my mother. That was the engine of all of it, and I want to name it plainly because I think it runs in a great many families. I had been taught, without anyone ever saying the words, that loving Eileen and loving my mother were a single pie with only so many slices, and that every kindness I gave my stepmother was a kindness stolen from the woman who cried in the evenings. A child believes that arithmetic completely. It took me 40 years and a box of photographs to learn that love does not divide like that I could have loved Eileen with my whole heart and not taken 1 ounce away from my mother, and that the only thing my 40 years of frost ever actually protected was the wall itself. So for 40 years, I gave my stepmother nothing but good manners and a locked door, and I believed, the entire time, that I was in the right. I want to give you one memory, because it shames me, and it should. When I was 16, Eileen learned somehow that I had been struggling in chemistry, and she had been, before she married my father, a science teacher. And one afternoon, she shyly offered to help me study, and she had even bought a workbook, the kind a teacher would know to buy. and I looked at that workbook in her hands, and I said, "My mom can help me." It was not true. My mother was wonderful, but she could not have helped me with chemistry to save her life. I said it only because I knew it would close the door, and I watched Eileen set the workbook down on the counter and say, lightly, that of course, that was fine. She left the workbook there. I never opened it. And I understand now that the workbook was not really about chemistry. It was a woman who had found one small, specific way she might be allowed to be useful to me, and had spent her own money on it, and had worked up the courage to offer it, and I had refused it in under 5 words, because refusing her felt like loyalty. I have thought about that abandoned workbook a great deal this year. Eileen died last spring, after a short illness. My father had passed a few years before her, so she died as a widow, and I went to her funeral the way I had done everything concerning Eileen for 40 years, present, appropriate, and untouched. I stood in that room and felt, honestly, very little. I had spent 4 decades not letting this woman matter to me, and I had succeeded, and her death felt like the closing of a door that had always been closed anyway. I notice now, telling you this, how proud I had quietly been of that, of feeling little at her funeral. For 40 years, I had treated my own coldness toward Eileen as a kind of achievement, as proof of my loyalty, as a thing I had done well. I stood in that funeral home and took a private, terrible satisfaction in how untouched I was, the way you might admire a wall you have kept in good repair for decades. I did not yet know that I was standing in a room, mourning, with complete indifference, one of the few people who had loved me steadily and asked nothing back. I thought my numbness was strength. It was just the wall, doing the last of its work. And then, a few weeks later, the box came. Eileen had left instructions, it turned out, small, specific instructions, the kind of thing she had apparently put in order before she died. And one of them was that a particular box, which she had set aside and labeled with my name, Diane, was to be delivered to me. I almost did not open it. I will be honest about that. It sat in my hallway for nearly a week because some part of me did not want anything from Eileen, did not want her reaching across death to hand me something. But curiosity, in the end, is stronger than a 40-year-old grudge. One evening, I sat down on my hallway floor and I opened my stepmother's box. And it was full of photographs. I should tell you what I expected in the moment before I lifted the lid, because the gap between what I expected and what was there is the whole story. I expected, honestly, to feel intruded upon one last time. I expected the box to be Eileen's attempt to have a final word, some letter explaining herself, some plea, some reaching across death for the warmth I had denied her in life. I had my defenses up. I was ready, even then, even with the woman dead and buried, to keep the wall standing. That is how deep 40 years runs. I lifted the lid, braced for a woman trying to take something from me. Instead, I found a woman who had spent 4 decades quietly trying to give. Hundreds of them. Loose photographs and small albums and envelopes from photolabs, decades of pictures. And I started going through them, there on the floor, expecting, I suppose, pictures of Eileen's life. Pictures of her and my father. Pictures of a woman I had refused to know. Instead, I found pictures of me. The box was full of me. It was a 40-year photographic record of my own life, assembled by my stepmother, and it was a record of events I had absolutely no memory of her attending. Here was a photograph of me at a middle school band concert, taken from somewhere in the back of the auditorium. Here was me at a high school cross-country meet, a small, distant figure crossing a finish line, the picture taken from the far side of the fence. My graduation. A community college awards night I had nearly forgotten. And, more recent, more impossible, a photograph of me, just a few years ago, leaving the building of the dental practice where I work, walking to my car, entirely unaware that anyone was taking my picture at all. I want to be precise about what that last photograph did to me, because it is the one that stopped my breath. The others, the childhood ones, could almost be explained away. A stepmother at a school concert. Fine, families overlap. Perhaps my father had dragged her along. But the recent one could not be explained that way. My father was already gone by then. Eileen had no reason on earth to be near my workplace. She was an aging widow with a stepdaughter who had given her 4 decades of frost, and yet there she had been, at some point in the last few years, sitting in a car outside my office, waiting, just to see me walk to my own car for 10 seconds. Not to speak to me. She knew better than to try to speak to me. Just to see me. And then to drive home alone with the photograph. I sat on my hallway floor holding that picture, and I felt, for the first time in 40 years, the full and exact shape of what I had refused. I sat on that hallway floor, and I did not understand what I was holding, but I understood enough to feel the first crack run through the concrete. Because the woman I had been told about, the cold, calculating intruder, the woman who did not care about me, that woman does not stand at the back of a 14-year-old's band concert in the dark, taking a photograph of a stepdaughter who will not even speak warmly to her. I needed to understand, so I kept going. And underneath the photographs, at the bottom of the box, I found the letters. There was a bundle of them, and they were not letters to me. They were letters Eileen had written and never sent. To me, about me, across 40 years. A few a year, sometimes just a paragraph, dated, and reading them, on that floor, late into the night, I finally met my stepmother. The real one. Not the one I had been handed at 14. And the first thing the letters told me, gently, because Eileen was gentle even in private, even when no one would ever read it, was that the story of the intruder was not true. Eileen had not broken up my parents' marriage. She had not turned my father's head. She had not been there at all. My parents' marriage, the letters told me, and my mother has since painfully confirmed it. My parents' marriage had been quietly over for years before it ended. They had been 2 people who had stopped loving each other a long time before, and who had finally, exhaustedly, agreed to stop. Eileen had come into my father's life well after the divorce was finished and the papers were signed. She had not been the cause of the earthquake. She had simply been the next thing that happened, after. There was a line in one of those letters that I have not been able to put down since. Eileen wrote, early on, that she had known from the very beginning what story I had been told about her, and that she had made a deliberate decision never to fight it. She wrote that she could have tried to correct me, could have sat the angry teenager down and said, "That is not what happened. Your mother is wrong. Let me tell you the truth." And she wrote that she had decided not to, ever, because doing so would have meant asking a grieving child to choose between her mother and her stepmother, and forcing me to see my own mother as a liar. Eileen wrote, "It was better that she keep hating me than that she lose faith in her mother. A child needs her mother more than she needs the truth about me." She chose, knowingly, to wear the villain's costume for 40 years, to let me go on believing the worst of her, because she judged that my being able to love my mother without complication was worth more than her own good name. I had spent 40 years thinking Eileen was the selfish one in this story. She had spent those same 40 years quietly making the least selfish choice I have ever encountered. So, if Eileen had not broken my family, then where had the story of the intruder come from? And the answer to that is the saddest part of all of this, and the part I have had to forgive my way through. The story came from grief. I went to my mother after the box. I sat down with her, gently, and I asked her to tell me truly how the marriage had ended. And my mother, who is old now, and tired, and far enough from it to finally be honest, told me the truth. She told me that the divorce had been mutual and sad, and nobody's crime. And then she told me, with tears, that when Eileen had come along afterward, younger and starting fresh, and getting the version of my father that my mother felt she herself had used up her best years on, it had been unbearable. And so my mother had done a very human and very damaging thing. She had let herself believe, and then let herself say, that Eileen had stolen what was rightfully hers. It was not a calculated lie. It was a wound, looking for a shape it could survive, and the shape it found was a villain. And the villain it chose was Eileen. And the person who absorbed that villain, completely, permanently, was the 12-year-old standing in the room. Me. My mother did not set out to poison me against Eileen. I believe that. She set out to survive her own heartbreak, and a child standing nearby drank the poison meant for the heartbreak. That is how these things so often work. Nobody hands a child a grudge on purpose. The child simply picks up what the grieving adults keep leaving on the table. I asked my mother in that conversation the hardest question I had. I asked her whether she had ever known how completely I had taken it on, how total my coldness to Eileen had become. And my mother was quiet for a long time, and then she admitted something that cost her to say. She said that yes, she had seen it, over the years, had seen how hard I was with Eileen, and that there had been many moments, especially as I grew up, when she could have said something. When she could have told me to ease up, to give Eileen a chance, to not carry her mother's heartbreak as my own war. And she had not. She said that some small, wounded, unworthy part of her had been comforted by my loyalty, that having a daughter who refused to love Eileen had felt, on her loneliest nights, like being defended. She said she was more ashamed of that than of anything else in her life, and I held my mother's hand while she said it, because I understood. We had both done damage here. She had let a wound speak for her, and I had let her wound speak for me, and Eileen had stood at the end of all of it, taking the cold and saying nothing. Once I understood that, I had to go back through 40 years with Eileen and read every moment again, and it was like watching a film I thought I knew with the sound finally turned on. Every cool, distant memory I had of Eileen reorganized itself. I had remembered her as reserved, as never quite warm with me, and I had filed that as proof of the cold, calculating woman I had been promised. But the letters showed me what that reserve actually was. Eileen wrote, in one of them, about how terrified she had always been of pushing me, how she could see that I had decided who she was, and how she had concluded early that the kindest thing she could do was to never crowd me, never force herself on a child who so clearly did not want her. Her distance was not coldness. It was a woman tiptoeing, for 40 years, around a stepdaughter's locked door, afraid that knocking too hard would only make things worse. I had read her carefulness as proof she did not care. It was the exact opposite. She was careful because she cared, and because caring in my presence had nowhere safe to go. And the photographs broke me, because here is what they meant once I understood them. For 40 years, Eileen had known she was not allowed inside my life. I had made that completely clear. So she had done the only thing a person in her position could do. She had loved me from the only place I left available to her, which was the back of the room, the far side of the fence, the parking lot. She had come to my concerts and my meets and my graduation, and she had stood where I would not see her, and she had taken a photograph so that she could go home and have some small piece of the stepdaughter who would not let her any closer. 40 years of a woman attending the life of a child who had told her she would never matter, and asking that child for nothing, ever, in return. There was one envelope in the box, near the bottom, that was different from the others, and I have to tell you about it. It held photographs of empty places. A photograph of a school auditorium, mostly empty, taken from the very back row. A photograph of a hospital waiting room. A photograph of the outside of my first apartment building. And it took me a while, turning them over, to understand what they were. They were the events Eileen had not been able to attend, but had needed to be near anyway. The auditorium was a parent-teacher event she had not been welcome at, photographed afterward, from her seat in the dark, once everyone had gone. The hospital waiting room was from when I had my first child. I remember now that my father came, briefly, and I had assumed he came alone, and he had not. Eileen had been somewhere in that building, not allowed up, photographing a waiting room so she could feel she had been present for the birth of a grandchild she would never be permitted to hold. She had built a photographic record not only of my life, but of the edges of my life, the rooms next to the rooms I was in. That is how close I had let her come. The room next door. For 40 years. I want to be honest about the nights after I read those letters, because they were the hardest of my adult life. The grief was enormous, and it was a strange, disqualified kind of grief, because what right did I have to mourn Eileen? I had spent 40 years refusing her. I did not get to suddenly fall apart over her now that a box had told me what I had thrown away. And there was anger, too. A confused, swirling anger that did not know where to land. Some of it went toward my mother for handing me a villain, but I could not hold it there long because my mother had been a heartbroken woman, not a monster, and she had already paid for that wound by living inside it. And so the anger, in the end, had nowhere to go but the only place it truly belonged, which was at me. Because here is the unbearable thing. I was not a child for most of those 40 years. I was a grown woman for 30 of them. And a grown woman is supposed to be able to do the thing I never once did. To look at a story she was handed in childhood and ask, as an adult, is this actually true? Has anyone checked? I never checked. For 30 adult years, I never checked. I just kept the wall in good repair. Here is what I have done since. Because a story like this cannot end in only regret. Regret that just sits there is its own kind of waste. The first thing I did was the photographs themselves. I have gone through every one of them, and I have built, from Eileen's secret 40-year archive, a proper album. And I have given copies to my own children, and I have told them the true story. Not the story of the intruder, the real one. I have told my children that they had a step-grandmother who loved their mother faithfully for 4 decades from the back of every room and asked for nothing, and that their mother was too loyal to a wound that was not even hers to ever see it. My children will not inherit the grudge. The poison stops with me. That is the one clean thing I have been able to do. The second thing is harder and quieter and ongoing. I cannot apologize to Eileen. That door is closed, permanently, and I closed it myself, decades before she died, and no box can open it back up. I have had to learn to live with an apology I will never get to deliver. What I have done instead is the only thing left. I visit her. I go to where Eileen is buried, and I sit, and I talk to her, and I tell her the things the 14-year-old in her kitchen should have been capable of imagining. I tell her I know now. I tell her I saw the photographs. I tell her thank you. The thank you she waited 40 years for and never once asked me for. It is not enough. Nothing is enough. But Eileen spent 40 years loving me from the only place I allowed her, and I have decided that the least I can do is spend my remaining years loving her back from the only place she has left me. The back of the room, it turns out, is a place you can love someone from. She taught me that. She taught me that, and I was not even paying attention while she did. I did one more thing, and it is the one I was most afraid of. I went to find the people in Eileen's life. A sister of hers, 2 old friends, the people who had loved Eileen back when I would not. And I did something that humbled me to my bones. I apologized to them. I sat with Eileen's sister, an old woman now, and I told her that I knew what I had been, that I had spent 40 years being cold to a person who had only ever been good to me, and that I was sorry the family she loved had contained a daughter like me. And Eileen's sister did something I did not expect. She did not let me wallow. She took my hand, and she told me that Eileen had never once, in 40 years, spoken a bitter word about me, not one, and that Eileen had always said the same thing about me, that the coldness was not really mine, that I was a good girl carrying a grief that had been handed to me too young, and that she had never blamed me for it. Eileen had spent 40 years not only loving me from the back of the room, but defending me, to her own family, from the consequences of how I treated her. Even her sister's forgiveness, it turned out, had been arranged in advance, by Eileen, on my behalf. There was no end to what that woman had quietly done for me. I keep finding more of it. A little over a year has passed now since the box arrived. My relationship with my mother is, strangely, all right. We had to walk through some hard and honest conversations, but my mother is old, and the truth, once it was finally out loud, seemed almost to relieve her, as though she had been tired, for decades, of guarding a story she half knew was unfair. We do not dwell on it. There is no point. 2 women cannot unspend 40 years. My children have asked me, more than once this year, why I keep going back to the cemetery, why I keep talking to a woman who can no longer hear me, and I have told them the truth, which is that I am not really doing it for Eileen. Eileen is at peace. She made her peace decades ago, in a way I am only now beginning to understand. I go because of what it does to me. Each time I sit there and say the words, I know now, I saw the photographs, thank you. I am practicing a thing I should have learned at 14 and never did. How to let a quiet love in, even late, even when it cost you the comfortable story you built your life on. Eileen is teaching me, still, from the back of the room. She was always going to be the one who taught me. I just needed 40 years to sit down and listen. The photograph I keep on my own wall now is one from the very bottom of the box. It is a picture of me at my high school graduation. A distant shot, taken from the back, my cap just visible in a sea of other caps. It is not a good photograph. It is blurry and badly framed, and I am barely in it. And it is, I think, the most loving object I own, because someone who was not allowed to sit with the family, someone who had been told for years by that family's daughter that she would never matter, drove to that ceremony anyway, and stood at the back, and lifted a camera, and kept the blurry, distant proof that she had been there, loving a girl who would not turn around. I look at that bad photograph every single day now. It is 40 years of an answer to a question I was too certain to ever ask. I want to leave you with the two things this taught me. The first is about the stories we are handed in childhood, especially the ones with a villain in them. When you are a child, you do not choose your family's stories. You simply receive them, fully formed, from the grown-ups you love and trust, and you carry them forward without ever inspecting the box they came in. That is forgivable in a child. What is not forgivable, and what I am asking you to look at honestly, is carrying that story unchecked into your adult life. If there is a person your family has always agreed to dislike, the intruder, the difficult one, the one who supposedly did the unforgivable thing, I am asking you to do the thing I failed to do for 30 adult years. Ask where that story came from. Ask whether the people who handed it to you were calm or whether they were wounded. Ask whether anyone ever actually checked. A grudge you inherited is not the same as a grudge you verified, and you may be guarding a wall around someone who only ever wanted to bring you photographs. The second thing is gentler, and it is about how to recognize love that does not look the way you expect. I spent 40 years certain Eileen did not care about me, and my evidence was that she was never warm, never pushed, never inserted herself. I had the evidence exactly backwards. Some people cannot love you loudly, sometimes because of who they are, and sometimes, as with Eileen, because you yourself have left them no louder place to stand. So they love you from the back of the room. They show up where you will not see them. They keep the blurry photograph. If there is someone in your life whose love you have dismissed because it is quiet, because it stays at a careful distance, because it never demands anything from you, look harder and look sooner than I did. The distance may not be indifference. It may be the only place you have left them to love you from. If this story landed for you, drop the word photographs in the comments below. I read them. It tells me which stories are worth telling next. Subscribe for new stories, real patterns, full narratives, the long game. 2 small pieces of wisdom from this one before I go. First, a grudge you inherited is not a grudge you have earned the right to keep. Children absorb the dislikes of the wounded adults around them, and that is not their fault. But somewhere in adulthood, every one of those inherited stories quietly becomes your responsibility. Before you spend one more year disliking the person your family taught you to dislike, stop and ask the question a loyal child never asks. Who told me this? What were they feeling when they told me? And has anyone, ever, actually checked if it is true? An unexamined grudge can cost you 40 years and a person who loved you. Second, do not measure love only by its warmth and its volume. The loud, easy, demonstrative love is real, but it is not the only kind, and it is not always the most faithful. Some of the most devoted love in the world is quiet and patient and keeps its distance, sometimes by nature, sometimes because the person being loved has allowed it no closer. If someone shows up for you steadily and asks for nothing, if they stay at the edges of your life without complaint, do not mistake that restraint for indifference. Look at what they do, not how loudly they do it. The person at the back of the room may love you more than anyone in the front. Don't inherit a grudge you never checked. I'll see you next time.